Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right, guys, number 13. I created a playlist. Thanks whoever it was that recommended I create a playlist for these for the 1 to 12 English history videos from History Matters, and I did so. So it's easier for you to find if you haven't watched those and if you want to. But that's up to you. How you guys doing, by the way? Not that I can hear you answer, but if you're doing good, that's great. If not, then that sucks, but you'll be good soon, don't worry. Emotions are fickle, my friend.
1286 and Scotland is in crisis.
If you're not ready to learn, there's the door. Get out of here. Or just chill, that's fine too. All right, let's do it. Oh, original link to the video, top of the description. My name's Connor, if you're new. I'm from New England, Rhode Island, greatest state in the Union. And the link to the Discord if you want to just join a community that likes to learn about history and talk about that stuff or just hang out. Just click that Discord link. It'll send you right over there. More the merrier. Pull up a chair. Love to have you. Let's go. So, is this William Wallace time? I know people say it's historically inaccurate, but it's one of my favorite movies. It is, all right? Everything's good. Good. You guys are good. Let's go.
This crisis was the result of the untimely death of King Alexander III. 1286 and Scotland is in crisis. This crisis was the result of the untimely death of King Alexander III, who had no direct male heirs. This crisis brought to the forefront of Scottish politics the problems surrounding Scotland's position relative to England. Since 1066, Scottish kings had regularly pledged their loyalty and had sometimes outright submitted to the kings of England. To the kings of England, this meant that Scotland could not appoint a new king without their say-so, and importantly, a new king would have to recognise the superiority of the English monarch. Both the kings of England and the kings of Scotland held lands in each other's kingdoms. English-owned lands in Scotland were subject to English law, whereas the Scottish-owned lands in England were also subject to English law. So before he died, Alexander III had his granddaughter, Margaret, the daughter of the King of Norway, acknowledged as his heir. Margaret was only 3 at this time, and so the governance of Scotland fell to a group of 6 men known as the Guardians. Until he died, Alexander III had his granddaughter, Margaret, the daughter of the King of Norway, acknowledged as his heir. Margaret was only 3 at this time, and so the governance of Scotland fell to a group of 6 men known as the Guardians until she was old enough to make the journey back.
Okay.
They had several responsibilities. The first was to govern, the second was to appoint a regent to rule in Margaret's name until she was of age, the third was to find her a husband. The Guardians approached Edward I of England to arrange a marriage between Margaret and Edward's eldest son, Edward. The arrangements were finalised in the 1290 Treaty of Bergen, which
Not my gentle son. What news of the north?
Stipulated that the kingdoms of Scotland and England would remain entirely separate and that England was not Scotland's superior. Remember that any children of the marriage between Edward and Margaret would inherit both England and Scotland, which had the potential for political union. This concerned the Scottish, who weren't particularly keen on the idea.
I know I'm messing something up. Sorry about keep pausing, but because wasn't a French queen? I mean, maybe they got that wrong. All right. Sorry.
And Scotland, which had the potential for political union. This concerned the Scottish, who weren't particularly keen on the idea of being Walesed. The worries around future offspring became moot after Margaret died later in 1290. This had the effect of plunging Scotland into another succession crisis, which saw 2 major claimants. The first was John Balliol and the second was Robert Bruce. The process of choosing a new king is often referred to as the Great Cause, since it was kind of important. There were worries about the potential for civil war, and so Edward I was invited to adjudicate and select one of the 2 as the next King of Scots. He did so on the condition that the claimants acknowledge him as their rightful lord, which they did. In 1292, Edward sided with John Balliol, so King John's reign was overshadowed by Edward, who often asserted his own authority over Scotland as its rightful lord. One way he did this was to give English courts jurisdiction over Scotland. He also demanded that Scotland, as his vassal, had to provide men and money for the war with France. The war had started because Philip IV of France had declared Edward's possessions in France were forfeit, and war with France was expensive, hence why the Scottish wanted no part of it. The continued humiliations by Edward were too much for John's lords to bear, and so in 1295 they took over governing the realm and appointed 12 men as its guardians. One of the first acts by this Council of Guardians was to sign a treaty of alliance with France in the same year. The next year King John renounced his homage to Edward, which was, to put it lightly, upsetting to him. To Edward this was nothing short of treason, and so, invasion. The English and Scottish armies clashed at Dunbar, which was an overwhelming English victory. In the wake of Dunbar, the Scottish army collapsed and was scattered, and many prominent Scottish nobles were imprisoned. Edward then took several castles, the most notable being Edinburgh, which held out for only 5 days. Within 5 months of the first English troops crossing the border, King John Balliol had abdicated. Soon after this, the Stone of Destiny, an important part of the coronation ceremony and a symbol of Scottish independence, was taken to England by Edward. Balliol was locked up in the Tower of London and Edward took over the running of Scotland. John de Warenne was appointed as the Guardian of Scotland and Hugh de Cressingham was appointed as its treasurer. In 1297, most of the Scottish nobility submitted to Edward and pledged their fealty. Not all Scots were willing to do this, and resistance to English rule began to pick up in the second half of 1297. In the north, where English authority was weaker, the resistance was led by Andrew Murray, whereas in central Scotland it was led by William Wallace. These two joined forces and launched numerous raids against English-held towns, and the Scottish regained control of important cities and castles. They eventually cleared the English out of all of the north, barring Dundee, which they then laid siege to. Edward tasked Warenne with relieving this siege, who assembled an army.
I'm trying so hard not to make Braveheart quotes. All right.
Barring Dundee, which they then laid siege to. Edward tasked Warenne with relieving this siege, who assembled an army and marched north. In order to get to Dundee, this army needed to cross the River Forth and chose to do so here at Stirling. It was here the English army met the Scottish one at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Whilst crossing the bridge, the English, including Hugh de Cressingham, were slaughtered, whereas the Scottish only suffered minor casualties, which happened to include Andrew Murray. Warenne retreated, and as a result, the English had basically abandoned Scotland. This left William Wallace as the primary leader of the Scottish resistance. He started to reach out to foreign kingdoms to re-establish diplomatic and trade links, and he also began to administrate the areas of Scotland which were under his control. Wallace began raiding across the border, and following the retreating English, the Scottish burned hundreds of villages before they themselves turned back to Scotland. Wallace was appointed as the Guardian of Scotland and began to prepare for Edward's inevitable retaliation. Edward was at this point fighting in France, and after making peace with the French, he returned to York, and in mid-1298 he and his army crossed into Scotland. The English and Scottish clashed at the Battle of Falkirk, which the English won handily, mostly due to Edward's use of Welsh longbowmen. Wallace was forced to retreat and his reputation was in ruins. He was replaced as the Guardian of Scotland by two men, the first being a man called Robert the Bruce and the second being John Comyn. The two hated each other, and it wasn't long before Robert the Bruce resigned. Fortunately, Wallace's early diplomatic efforts had paid off, particularly those with France and the papacy. The French king took custody of John Balliol, and the Pope ordered Edward to halt his advance, which Edward promptly ignored. Fighting continued intermittently over the coming years, and it was during this, in 1302, when Robert the Bruce pledged his loyalty to Edward. In 1304, Edward struck a decisive blow and the Scottish nobility submitted again. William Wallace did not submit, however, and he continued to harass the English. This harassment continued until 1305, when he was captured just outside of Glasgow, taken back to England, given a show trial and executed. Shortly afterwards, Edward issued the Ordinance for the Government of Scotland, which gave Scottish lords some autonomy, but Scotland was legally considered a conquered territory. During the peace, Robert the Bruce saw an opportunity for himself. The Scottish king was gone, and Bruce was a relative of the previous king Alexander III, meaning he had a claim. Only one other man could contest the throne, and that was John Comyn, and Robert found a subtle and clever way of getting around Comyn's claim. He murdered him. Robert made the mistake of murdering him in a church, which the Pope did not like, and so, excommunication. A month after Comyn's death, Robert the Bruce was crowned King Robert. Many of the Scottish nobility weren't happy with this, and after some fighting, Robert fled into exile. In 1307, Edward I died and was succeeded by his son, Edward II. Unlike his...
Not my gentle son. Sorry.
In 1307, Edward I died and was succeeded by his son, Edward II. Unlike his father, Edward II was not exactly the martial type and did little to challenge Robert. Robert now had a free hand in Scotland, and by 1308 he was in control of this territory, and by 1309 the Scottish nobles had been brought to heel. Being much more secure in his position, Robert started to concentrate on the running of his kingdom, and he established links with France, the papacy and Norway. He held Parliament at St Andrews here, but his main focus was on war with England and the recovery of the southern Scottish lands. So in 1310 King Edward ventured north, but this invasion came to nothing, primarily because Edward was on the brink of civil war with his lords. Edward's conflict with his nobles lasted until 1313, and during this time Robert capitalised and retook all of these lands. He then demanded that the remaining Scottish nobles renounce their homage to Edward and give it to him. So Edward was now unable to ignore the Scottish threat, and in 1314 he marched a large army into Scotland. The two sides met here at Bannockburn, and England, with its much larger and better equipped army, seemed certain to win, yet...
That's the battle Al Murray was talking about.
The two sides met here at Bannockburn, and England, with its much larger and better equipped army, seemed certain to win. Yet, due to immense tactical errors by the English, the Scottish were victorious and the English army was scattered and retreated. After Bannockburn, the vast majority of Scottish territory was firmly under Robert's control. Robert began to take the fight to the English and invaded. Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, was ordered to invade Ireland in 1315 in the hopes of setting up his own kingdom there. Furthermore, Edward was also made the heir to the Scottish throne since Robert didn't have any children. The reason for the invasion of Ireland was to cut off Irish taxes to England and to open up a second front which would cost the English a lot more money. Long story short, it didn't go too well, and in 1318 Edward was killed at the Battle of Pockhart, and with him died the idea of a Scottish-ruled Ireland. Robert tasked men like James Douglas with increasingly ambitious raids into England, and in 1318 he retook Berwick. The war was fairly quiet for the next 2 years, barring the Scottish victory at the Battle of Myton. In 1320 his clergymen and his nobles sent a declaration called the Declaration of Arbroath to the Pope. This declaration stated that Scotland was an independent kingdom, that Robert was its rightful king due to his actions, and that Edward I and II were unjust in any attempt to conquer Scotland. The papacy officially considered Edward Balliol, the son of the now dead King John, to be the rightful king of Scotland, though. In 1320, King Robert also uncovered a plot against him by William de Soules, who was likely working on behalf of Edward Balliol. Robert had William brought before him, and he was tried, found guilty, and spent the rest of his life locked up. In 1324, the issue of the succession was dealt with when Robert's heir, David, was born, and 2 years later the Scottish renewed their alliance with the French with the Treaty of Corbeil. 1327 saw a major upheaval in England which greatly affected the Scottish Wars. This upheaval was the ousting of Edward II by his wife Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. Edward was forced to abdicate, the first English king to ever do so, and he was replaced with his son, Edward III. Edward was too young to govern on his own, and so the running of the kingdom fell to Isabella and Mortimer. Both Mortimer and Edward wanted Scotland back under English domination, and so in 1327, invasion. This invasion went terribly, and the English were forced to sue for peace. This culminated in the 1328 Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, in which both sides agreed that 1. Scotland was independent and not under English overlordship, 2. Robert the Bruce and his heirs were the rightful kings of the Scots, and 3. It settled the border between England and Scotland as being this, i.e. the pre-war border.
Very interesting. So the fighting with England and the winning against England definitely didn't stop with the death of Wallace, and I'm sure, because of the movie and loving the movie, I'm putting William Wallace's relevance as higher than it probably is. I'm not saying he's irrelevant, but so a lot of what kind of connects to, I don't want to say stuff I'm not sure about, but I just think of like Mary, Queen of Scots, and that stuff, and I feel like this might be the beginning of that line, I'm guessing. But I'm definitely learning a lot this episode.
Scots, and 3. It settled the border between England and Scotland as being this, i.e. the pre-war border, meaning everyone died for nothing. In return for all of this, the English were to get a sack of cash. Edward also agreed to return the Stone of Destiny, but that took a bit longer than expected, by which I mean it wasn't returned until 1996. So the English nobility saw this treaty as completely humiliating, which is why ultimately the peace between England and Scotland wouldn't last. There are many important legacies to the First Scottish War of Independence. 2 major ones were the affirmation of a Scottish identity and the establishment of the Old Alliance, which meant that any English war with either France or Scotland would become a war on 2 fronts, which unsurprisingly happens many times in the coming centuries. Yet as far as England was concerned, it made it clear that the English were not the uncontested lords of the British Isles, and that the future English-Scottish relationship would operate within the framework of war, at least for the next 3 centuries. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching. There are some books in the description.
I learned a lot there, and I feel like that was a key sort of connecting episode from what I somewhat knew to what I somewhat knew. I hope that makes sense, to what, from William Wallace's time and knowing about those wars as most Americans would know just through the movie, and then to the King Henry VIII time. I feel like it's a big gap in between there that I know very little about. And this is sort of starting to fill in that gap. Awesome episode. History Matters. Great channel. All right. I'll be back with another one soon. I'll definitely do some more videos today. And I'll try to get out the next video of this in the next few days. Hope you guys are doing well. See you next time.